Some of you may have seen the article that appeared in just this week by happy coincidence with today's lecture. How many of you saw the article on molecular gastronomy in the New York Times on Tuesday? There's a science section in the New York Times, and of course you can get the Times online as well as in print. And this particular piece was written by one of the New York Times regular science journalists, Kenneth Chang. And he titled this article, Chefs as Chemists, and includes in the article interviews with some notable chefs in New York City mostly, but also in Chicago and on our own West Coast in Los Gatos, California. It's a very nice piece with lots of pictures on the online version of some of these famous restaurants and the chefs' kitchens in which, oddly, their shelves are lined with bottles and with metallic-like receptacles and whatnot, which Chang says makes it look as much like a pharmacist shop as a haute cuisine chef's kitchen. In any case, we're delighted today to have with us someone who's going to talk about molecular gastronomy and the way in which this trend in haute cuisine came to have this particular name through a series of very popular texts in the 1980s. But she will be telling you about that, not me. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Rachel Ankeny with us today. Her special field of expertise originally and still is in the history and philosophy of science, particularly the life sciences and the medical sciences. She did her graduate work at the University of Pittsburgh and taught for a while at Connecticut College before going to Australia, where she was recently the chair of the History and Philosophy of Science unit at the University of Sydney. And she, as then as now, is a particular expert in fields that have to do with biomedical ethics, reproductive technology, stem cell research, and the development of science policy in these areas. She serves on a number of policy boards and advisory boards in Australia that have to do with these issues. However, Rachel Ankeny's interests are multiple, and she became increasingly interested in pursuing professional studies in gastronomy and took a graduate degree in gastronomy at the University of Adelaide, which, as some of you may know, like much of Australia, is a wonderful wine-producing region and an Epicurean delight in its own regard. And she now has moved to the University of Adelaide, where she is both a lecturer, a senior lecturer in the program in history and politics, and as well a program director for the graduate program in gastronomy at Adelaide. And her current researches now include, as well as the older interest, food ethics, culinary traditions, the relationship of food to cuisine, and as well a theme that one of our later lecturers will address in January, the relationship between food traditions and national and ethnic identities. But it's a pleasure to have her with us today, and she's going to talk with us on the subject of how to cook an egg and other lessons from the kitchen lab, a history of molecular gastronomy. Join me in welcoming Dr. Ankeny.
Thanks, Mary Jo, for the nice introduction, and thanks to you and Steve for the invitation. I'll just start, I think. So here's some good examples of some molecular gastronomy. If you're looking at a menu and you see a dish that says it blends white chocolate and caviar, or offers smoked bacon and egg ice cream with French toast and tomato jam, you're probably seeing an instance of molecular gastronomy. If the main device in the restaurant's kitchen is a blowtorch, as you can see on the slide there, or liquid nitrogen suddenly appears at your table, again, you're probably witnessing an instance of what is now called molecular gastronomy. An increasing number of chefs around the world are using the principles derived from this field in order to either concoct unusual dishes, like some of the ones you see here, or to perfect classical ones. Now, molecular gastronomy has been defined in many different ways. Among these definitions are that it's a field that attempts to link chemistry and to culinary science in order to explain transformations that occur during cooking and to improve culinary methods through a better understanding of the underlying chemical composition of food. However, as critics of more narrow approaches to molecular gastronomy note, some of its advocates seem to consider taste, appearance, texture, or other qualities of food simply as the necessary end result of exploiting the chemical properties of food, without paying much regard to the craft aspects of cookery or cuisine. Others point out that the restaurants utilizing these techniques today seem focused less on food and more on creating magic tricks or circus acts. Some have been described as turning dinner into performance art, theater, or sensual orgy. And the foods produced are sometimes downright bizarre. As an Australian restaurant critic recently wrote in an article entitled "The Menu from Outer Space," the Earl Grey tea jelly was cut into strips like tagliatelle. There was surprisingly nice brown onion ice cream and delicious olive sorbet, black and salty sweet. The licorice ravioli tasted faintly of all sorts. We were eating from a menu that might have been designed by a woman pregnant with Willy Wonka's love child. Food for complicated cravings and weird whimsies, end quote. But what is molecular gastronomy and how is it different from existing fields such as food science or food technology or even just cookery? How can we understand its increasing popularity and even the more widespread interest in recent days in the science of food? What social and cultural forces underpin this trend into making cuisine into a science? Today in this talk, I want to explore how molecular gastronomy has established itself and argue that it does so in part by utilizing not only the usual authorities that are looked to in order to authenticate and credential cuisine, such as chefs or cookbook authors or food writers, but how it also does so by relying on science, or more precisely, a very particular view of science, which I'll talk about later. This view generally makes an equation between what is authentically scientific and therefore what is the best way to cook. At the same time, an increasing number of chefs and restaurants have begun to use molecular gastronomy techniques, seeking to create unique flavors and dining experiences with their patrons. And I want to explore this intersection between these trends of both making cuisine scientific and the increased uptake in haute cuisine restaurants of molecular gastronomy. So first, a few words about sort of the origins or the prehistory of molecular gastronomy. To do this, we have to think very briefly about what gastronomy is. So if you consider for a moment Jean-Anselme Brillat-Savarin's classic definition of gastronomy, which was in his book Physiology of Taste of 1825, gastronomy is the intelligent knowledge of whatever concerns man's nourishment. Pretty simple. He goes on to write that gastronomy is part of natural history, physics, chemistry, as well as cookery, business, and political economy. So he sees this as a very fundamental undertaking. Etymologically, the word gastronomy derives from ancient Greek words for gastros, meaning stomach, and nomos, meaning law or knowledge. More generally, gastronomy today is often described in the way that Brillat-Savarin did as an interdisciplinary undertaking, which studies the relationships between food and culture. Now, the historian Alain-Claude Rodeau argues that the history of food science can be traced back really to the mid-1700s, so pretty early in the days of things becoming scientific. At the point in time when a significant portion of the inhabitants of Western Europe began to be interested in food as something more than a material for sustenance. The type of food science then that was developed was not initially focused primarily on food safety. This happened later in the 18 and 1900s as there was a shift towards these concerns, but instead looked at sensory perceptions and particularly the study of taste. And again, as Brillat-Savarin stated in his book in an infamous retort to his cook, "You're somewhat opinionated, and I've had a little trouble making you understand that the phenomena which occur in your laboratory are nothing more than the execution of the eternal laws of nature, and that certain things which you do inattentively, and only because you've seen others do them, are nonetheless based on the highest and most abstruse scientific principles." So even in these days, there was a very solid recognition that the grounding of most cookery and cuisine was in fact science. And there's been a long history of scientists who we would now recognize probably as chemists or physicists who were actually exploring food. For instance, Antoine Lavoisier, among the many things that he did in his career, investigated the confection of stocks in his capacity as a public official responsible for supplying Paris hospitals with food. And he devised an instrument to measure how much meat you needed in order to concoct a broth that had a certain amount of nutrients that were necessary for patients' health. Similarly, Benjamin Thompson, later known as Count Rumford, published a very long book with a very long title on the construction of kitchen fireplaces and kitchen utensils, together with remarks and observations relating to the various processes of cookery and proposals for improving that most useful art, 1776. He noted the importance of recognizing this field of study as part of science, noting in particular in what art or science could improvements be made that would more powerfully contribute to increasing the comforts and enjoyments of mankind. And these go on. There's numerous scientists in this period through the 18th and 19th centuries. Just to summarize a few additional ones who look at the history of food, von Liebig, who famous for his meat extracts, even to this day in some brand names, and Maillard, who described the browning reactions which give flavor to grilled meats, roasted coffee and chocolate, and many other foods. So the term molecular gastronomy was coined against this historical background and against the knowledge of these traditions. The term was coined in the late 1980s by the British physicist Nicolas Curdy, who's pictured here, and the French food scientist and former journalist Hervé Thys, who felt that empirical knowledge and tradition were as important in cooking as rational understanding. As early as the late 1960s, Curdy had given a talk at the Royal Society of London called The Physicist in the Kitchen, in which he demonstrated the recently invented microwave oven and made what he called a reversed baked Alaska. It was cold on the outside and hot on the inside, and hence came to be known as a frozen Florida. In later years, Curdy and Thys organized several international workshops in Ankeny, Sicily, on what they called then molecular and physical gastronomy. Later, they abbreviated this to just molecular gastronomy, in part because they thought that was a more powerful term. That because the rhetoric surrounding everything going molecular was very prominent in this period, it was important to hitch themselves on to these trends of molecularization. As Thys explains, they didn't call their field of research molecular cooking because they clearly wanted to brand it as a science and not as a craft or an art. They also explicitly wanted to distinguish it from the technology of cooking because they weren't primarily seeking applications, but instead were searching for the underlying principles that would help to answer a wide range of questions associated with food, whether it's cooked or not. However, according to them, molecular gastronomy also aims to provide a sound basis for practical knowledge, a rationalization and refinement of culinary techniques. So that's the general background of the sorts of things that are at stake when people make reference to molecular gastronomy. It's a fairly heterogeneous collection of approaches. What I want to do now is look at one particular approach, as Mary Jo mentioned in the introduction. Currently, what we see is molecular gastronomy has taken on popularity not only through high-end restaurants and chefs, but also through scholarly and more popular books published in primarily the 1990s and the 2000s, including, pictured here, the physicist Peter Burham's The Science of Cooking, and probably better known to you, the chemistry professor and food writer Robert Woolke's What Einstein Told His Cook series. I want to focus on the fourth book that's pictured here, which is Harold McGee's On Food and Cooking, The Science and Lore of the Kitchen. The book was originally published in 1984 and was significantly revised for a 2004 reissue, and I think it's an important way to try to examine some of the trends in molecular gastronomy. In the 2004 version, the book's introduction stresses that although the relationship between science and cooking might not have seemed obvious back in the 1980s when the first edition appeared, that it was notable by 2004, food lovers everywhere can find the science of cooking just about everywhere. This book is often termed the Bible of molecular gastronomy, particularly for professional chefs. They often would also mention, of course, Curdy and Thys's work. And they'd also talk about the experimental cooking of chefs such as Heston Blumenthal of the Fat Duck in England, Pierre Gagnier of France, and Ferran Adri of Spain. And some of these people will come back later in the talk. As Blumenthal himself claims, Harold McGee's book was the single biggest catalyst of the path I'm following now. And his restaurant, the Fat Duck in Bray, UK, is probably one of the prime advocates of this molecular gastronomy style of cooking. Perhaps most importantly then, On Food and Cooking, or OFC as I'll call it from now on, self-consciously uses scientific research to explain or debunk traditional cooking techniques and so-called old wives' tales. and explicitly defends this approach. In addition, frequent publications in technical and popular scientific journals have helped to position McGee's work within a broader context of scientific credibility, as I'll talk about in a moment. What I want to do now is show a few examples that come out of the book. The book is 700-800 pages, incredibly thick. But what I want to look at is the scientific language and imagery used in the book, which I think is characteristic more generally of the genre of molecular gastronomy. And what I'll argue is that this is reminiscent of a scientific vision that links power and control to understanding. In these kinds of approaches, experimental techniques are prioritized over observation or experiential data gathering as the best means for developing a true, so-called scientific understanding, and thus, in this case, implicitly communicating to the reader that there's one and only one correct and best way to cook. The book and other, again, this is just one example, other sorts of work in this genre utilizes myth-making devices to position itself as providing definitive and timeless answers about the fundamental mechanisms of the natural world, about what's real and therefore what's ultimately correct and scientific. Thus, the book can be viewed as aiming to shape our conceptions of what the qualities of a good cook are, in part by shifting them away from the production of good food by empirical trial and error methods, the tradition that had sort of persisted until recent days. Instead, it promotes understanding why cooking techniques work in the way that they do and how to harness chemical principles to produce the desired effects. As McGee states, as a cook, I wanted to believe that chefs were right, that their experience of doing these things over and over must prove something. But as a scientist, I could see that the evidence didn't hold up. Thus, the book's primary target audience, and again, representing the whole genre, is usually serious cooks or professional chefs, particularly as more popularized and less serious food science texts are now available for mass consumption or bedtime reading. The questions that remain once the scientific data are available about how to make a truly fluffy souffle, or why a saddle of lamb is best cooked at very low temperature, are why we cook these dishes in other ways previously, and why we might even prefer the taste of things prepared in a manner different from that which has been scientifically accredited by these new self-appointed experts of the kitchen. The history of the unexpected success of OFC permits a glimpse into the process of constructing an audience through the making and subsequent unmaking of myths. And this is a very typical thing in the history of science that recurs, so perhaps not surprising it's occurring here. Originally, the book was intended as a reference book, and the editors planned an extremely small print run, just 2,500 copies. Before the book was published, McGee decided to undertake one new experiment, and what he was interested in looking at was the so-called myth of the copper bowl. He wanted to test the culinary dogma, long held, that egg whites beat up stiffest if you use a copper bowl. And this is the claim to fame, of course, if you go into a cookware shop trying to sell copper bowls. McGee noted, the copper bowl claim struck me as unlikely from the start. I figured it was either an old wives' tale or a promotional ploy by the copper industry. Spurred on by historical evidence of the use of copper bowls, for instance, it actually even occurs in Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie of 1771, McGee purchased a copper bowl and did what was to become a crucial experiment. As he puts it, I would have cried eureka if I hadn't been so invested in the idea that it was all a hoax. Compared with whites beaten in a glass bowl, the foam took almost twice as long to form, but it developed a lovely golden hue, became stiffer and moister, and stayed that way much longer. So the copper bowl did seem to win. The conclusion, however, did nothing more than reinforce what chefs had known for at least 200 years. And so McGee, together with two biologists, engaged in spectral analysis to determine why copper bowls cause this effect and to develop a theory of the mechanisms at work in the process. They found that an egg white protein called conalbumin had taken up copper from the bowl. And as the protein's three-dimensional molecules unfolded during the beating process, you break them up in a sense, the copper ions added strength to the protein's original structure, which was highly delicate. As protein bonds reinforced by metal are more stable, they're therefore more resistant. And as he puts it, they're more forgiving of a cook's inattention. Hence, it's much more difficult to overbeat egg whites to the point of irreversible collapse if you use a copper bowl. And if you've had the experience of beating egg whites and thinking, oh, this is coming along nicely, and then suddenly it just falls, it just collapses, that's what's going on. The moment at which you need to stop is a very delicate one. And the copper bowl increases the moment so that you're more likely to have a success. Now, the publication of this study appeared as a letter in the journal Nature and was noteworthy for several reasons. First, it used technical and scientific language, which is interesting, such as chicken albumin foams, rather than talking about meringue or something like this, and copper reaction vessels, i.e. the bowl, and traditional methodology of hypothesis testing. This set it apart pretty clearly from traditional cooking literature and allowed it to fit into a more sort of scientific genre. It established a tone for a whole new field, in a sense, of food science research that aims to investigate culinary practice in more scientific and even philosophical terms. It utilized a range of source materials and counted them all as equally credible. And these went from some of the historical sources I mentioned earlier in the talk to Julia Child, research articles ranging from things from the mainstream biochemistry to the less accessible Poultry Science Journal, emphasizing not only the scientific credibility of the research and the team performing it, but also their intellectual authority as a new generation of self-defined gastronomists. Perhaps most notably, McGee began to fashion himself explicitly as the heir to Brillat-Savarin, providing modern-day instructions so that the inattentive cook, you'll remember that's the term that Brillat-Savarin used, could avoid that fallen soufflé or non-fluffy meringue. Whereas Brillat-Savarin could only hint at the eternal laws of nature or possible principles underlying cooking methods, and often got it very, very wrong, McGee and others in this new generation were beginning to explore and substantiate long-held intuitions about the right way to cook. As Teese later noted, it's important to distinguish what is right from what is wrong, to rationalize the old chemical art of cooking, end quote. The letter to Nature might have remained buried in the back pages of the journal, but was rapidly picked up by wire services, reported in newspapers from Boston to Bangkok, which caused McGee's editors to triple the first print run of what was to be only a reference book, and to market OFC as trade, or it's even in airports sometimes, rather than reference, and the book became extremely popular. In the period then between the publication of the first edition in the mid-'80s and its reissue in 2004, the study of the everyday, but particularly cooking through scientific means, has claimed to have gained in respectability within science. For instance, in 1991, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Pierre-Gilles Dagen, who was also an attendee at these original molecular gastronomy workshops, for his work on the flow of large molecules relating to what happens when you stir a drink or move food around in your mouth. Various notable chefs adopted these techniques from what became an increasing number of molecular gastronomists, or scientists and others looking at the principles of molecular gastronomy, often inviting them to serve as consultants in their kitchen. The desire for control, which had begun within the mass production food industry, which had already embraced food chemistry and science in order to achieve replicability, usually at lower cost, in place of more empirical look and cook approaches, also took on these same principles. Although gourmet chefs were less concerned than, say, the mass food production about cost, molecular gastronomy did provide better control over food production, allowing more precision. For example, using a blowtorch to put the final browning touches on meat rather than what is fairly inexact oven baking, as well as quicker preparation, shorter completion times, and the unusual concoctions such as those shown on one of the earlier slides. By the 2004 edition of the book, McGee had a captive audience of converted gastronomers eager to learn the scientific principles that would distinguish their cooking from that of the non-scientific cooks, and clearly from that of the Food Network's, let 1,000 flowers bloom celebrity chefs. This is a different kind of level of interested parties. Using classic recipes, which McGee sometimes derogatorily terms time-tested and thoughtless, may allow us to avoid guesswork or having to experiment as we prepare a meal. But using thought and analysis, as he puts it, frees us from the necessity of following recipes and helps us deal with the unexpected, including the inspiration to try something new. Hence, the cook who merely wants to recreate the usual can stick with her traditional recipes, for which she likely will not understand the underlying principles that make them work. But the truly cutting-edge chef who wishes to be responsive to problems as they arise and to be creative, to be able to create innovative dishes, needs to absorb the principles of molecular gastronomy, according to these advocates, to become familiar with the molecular world and the actions and reactions within it. As McGee writes, thoughtful cooking means paying attention to what our senses tell us as we prepare it, connecting that information with past experience and with an understanding of what's happening to the food's inner substance, and adjusting preparation accordingly. The reader then of the book is convinced that only thoughtful cooking, by which is meant cooking that relies on scientific principles, and particularly those as articulated by molecular gastronomy, is creative and worthwhile. The rise of molecular gastronomy can be explained in sociological and historical terms in part through Pierre Bourdieu's idea of cultural capital, the means by which distinctions between social and other classes can be expressed and reinforced. During the 20th century, knowledge about food and preparation skills have altered, but oftentimes have actually served as forms of cultural capital. So for instance, once time pressures became more significant, and particularly when women entered the workforce in significant numbers, fewer people regularly prepared home-cooked meals. Thus, having leisure time to cook more elaborate meals became a positive indicator of social and economic status. As the scholar Paulina Dima argues, the constant variable throughout this transformation is that a wider knowledge of foods, an appreciation for foods that are acquired tastes, and familiarity with advanced preparation techniques, I would argue like molecular gastronomy, remains cultural capital. The last point in particular is nicely applicable to molecular gastronomy. High and low gourmet techniques and dishes have become increasingly more accessible, even just in the last 10 years, through a variety of popular media, notably the proliferation of television cooking shows, so that really anyone can watch and absorb how to prepare various dishes. She might not be able to get the ingredients due to cost or availability, and she might never cook. A lot of those TV shows are aspirational rather than real. But molecular gastronomy requires another level of engagement, a willingness to understand what's going on within the food in order to better control its production. So one of the points that I want to argue is books like OFC reinforce a form of cultural capital, we might want to call it gastronomic capital, that allows elite chefs and gourmands to distinguish themselves from the masses who can watch the Food Network, but at best merely ape the motions of celebrity chefs. Now, many kitchen traditions are unsubstantiated, and a trained molecular gastronomist can recognize this, and this is one of the repeated themes in molecular gastronomy. So for instance, why do we add salt to the water when cooking green vegetables? The usual response, if you look at classic cookbooks going quite a long ways back, French and in other traditions, is that salt maintains or enhances color. Also, it's often pointed out that salt lowers the boiling point of water and thus speeds up the cooking process. Now, the latter rationale is clearly absurd and unreasonable. The idea that you could lower a boiling point seems simply wrong. But its frequent inclusion in classic cookbooks helps to underscore that there was an open niche, or maybe a downright vacuum, of scientific knowledge about cooking. And this was the niche into which molecular gastronomy was able to position itself. In short, there's no good reason for adding salt, and the practice is continued by tradition rather than as a result of any rigorous testing, as McGee puts it. But in a recent interview, McGee notes the following, which is interesting. For the record, as every cook knows, green beans cooked in salted water definitely have more flavor. Somehow, the salt must inhibit osmosis of chlorophyll into the cooking water. Someday I'll figure out exactly how. And there's been a lot of exchanges in the field of molecular gastronomy over this problem. And these exchanges also reinforce the following idea: that molecular gastronomy has its power not just because of the answers it gives us, but because it makes these sorts of promises or holds out certain promissory notes that ultimately there will be a good scientific explanation, and this will help us rationalize what we like to eat, what we think tastes good, what works and what doesn't, even if currently there's an absence of explicit explanations or valid scientific theories for things that we do regularly. What is to count as a reason for cooking something in a particular way is a description of a chemical reaction that accords with our sensory experiences associated with foods produced using the method. The ultimate goal of the undertaking is to find the answer for why this works in the way it does. As Hervé Thies explains the principles of molecular gastronomy, success is guaranteed because the recipe has been tested scientifically. However, what this approach appears to rule out is that there might be a multiplicity of answers about why we do what we do in the kitchen and what we should do, particularly against the backdrop of the idea that we don't typically agree about what tastes good, how we want our food prepared, what we would prefer to eat. There might be some underlying common positive or negative human reactions to certain foods. Certain foods are toxic. We know young children resist certain kinds of vegetables and so on. Some people argue that this is an evolutionary adaptation. But leaving aside those sorts of instances, we can think of many more where there's just wild disagreement about what is a good food, what we like and what we don't like. Consider the fact, as long ago as 1930, a study showed that meat cooked at a constant temperature loses less moisture than meat given an initial searing to seal in the juices. Now, many of you, I'm sure your mothers taught you, you cook meat and you seal in the juices first and then you allow it to cook. But it's been known scientifically, going back, almost 80 years, that this is sort of incorrect if what you're interested in is keeping your meat moist. As McGee explains this, searing actually creates extra flavor through the browning of surface chemicals. This is the old Maillard reaction. But its effect on the juices is to pull them out. Hence, actually searing the meat makes it drier. So this is an interesting instance of one of those things where we keep doing it for a reason, and yet that reason is actually wrong. But at the same time, we keep doing it because it tastes good, because there are other sorts of properties that are going on. The novelist John Lancaster, who wrote The Debt to Pleasure, which is a book sort of focused on food, puts it more bluntly. Seared steak is less juicy, not more. Anyone who tells you different, a trusted cookbook or a beloved grandmother, is wrong, or at least according to the principles of molecular gastronomy. But wrong in what sense? Lancaster, in the same article, warns of a dangerous trend in food literature, which he believes rides on the coattails of molecular gastronomy. He notes a downbeat, pessimistic attitude more generally about food, one that stresses the threats of biotechnology and bioengineered foods, the fears that we have of food safety and of tainted products and so on. Food is now something we're supposed to be anxious about, and food is something that we're scared of in many instances. As Lancaster puts it, my principal beef with this is not the overall moral of the work, but its remorseless, inclusive insistence on the scientific. As we stand on the brink of a revolution in food technology, we need to be reminded that food is not primarily a form of medicine, that the story of mankind and food can be reduced to a science, but it's not primarily about science, that man's relationship with food is, and always has been, a terrible and passionate drama. End quote. So I think it's important to think in these terms and try to consider how molecular gastronomy might actually be helpful, but what dangers that there are. Molecular gastronomy must be cautious not to make the mistakes that are well recognized in the history of science, where so-called molecularization has proven powerful and yet problematic on all sorts of levels. Many scholars, myself included, have argued that an overemphasis on molecularization pushes strategies like reductionism to analysis to fundamental particles and may then leave out attention to other important factors. We're seeing changes in the current science of genomics towards focusing on, if not emergent properties, then higher level phenomena that aren't just in the genes. So not everything's in the genes, we know that, and geneticists always knew this too. But the rhetoric of molecularization really took a strong hold in the field for a very long time. The most important danger here is that the privileging of a molecular approach over all others then in turn allows us, or forces us, in fact, to privilege one approach as the way to know about the world. And that's equivalent to knowing how to control it. Although some molecular gastronomists make the future seem very exciting, especially if we can control our food production through better chemistry, the meaning of food seems to have now been reduced to its constituent molecules without adequate attention to emergent properties that might be produced, or to what we like and what we don't like, which may in fact not be scientific and might be based on old wives' tales. Contrast these sorts of approaches in molecular gastronomy to, for example, the approach of the Spanish chef Ferran Adrià, and his cooking, which he calls deconstructive. As the food historian Fabio Parasecoli describes Adria's approach, it's a Wittgensteinian kind of approach, similar to a game in which we must enter. The rules aren't fixed beforehand, but they're created while we're playing. Now, this is a little funny. I mean, Adria is one of the main advocates of molecular gastronomy, but he sees it as a creative and innovative source of new ideas rather than one that sort of dictates the rules of the game. It's a little odd because, of course, the rules that underlie molecular gastronomy are, in fact, the rules of molecular biology and chemistry, which are fixed and unchanging. So it's a little questionable how much leeway you have, what kind of games can be played when the fundamentals remain the same. Certainly, the rules of the language game we use to describe cooking are fixed if we think that molecular gastronomy is the ultimate kind of mechanism. But, leaving that aside, as Lancaster aptly summarizes it, we can't talk seriously about food without talking about what we think we are doing, as well as what it looks like we're doing. Food is never without meaning. Searing a steak to, quote-unquote, seal in the juices may not do anything to seal in the juices, but the truth is, searing makes meat taste juicier. When it comes to food, science can be wrong, even when it's right. So even as Curti and Thies, the prime advocates and sort of the founders of molecular gastronomy, put it, science can explain, analyze, and help in the creation of new dishes. But even though we're convinced that science has an important role in gastronomy, we firmly believe the scientist will never dethrone the chef. The greatest culinary creations will be, as they have always been, the result of artistic imagination, seasoned with a blend of empiricism and only a soupçon of science. Now, it might be claimed, and I'm suspicious about this, that a sort of conflict actually arises once you try to take these scientific principles of molecular gastronomy and use them to produce food. In its purest form, molecular gastronomy claims that its goals are entirely different than cooking, that they aren't actually about food production, but they're about understanding. And there may be some fundamental conflict there, but time limits me from getting into this. I think the other question that remains for another day is whether the experience of the diner in a molecular gastronomy kind of establishment is being diminished or enhanced because the food is made more scientific. And finally, just on a sort of closing note of skepticism, sometimes the science is wrong. Ironically, that copper bowl theory that I mentioned to you earlier that propelled McGee to fame was actually disproved by him, not by sort of using a very deductive method, but a simple trial and error, as he admits in the newest version of the book. One day, just on a whim, he couldn't find his copper bowl. It was dirty, whatever was going on. He tried a silver-plated bowl and, in fact, whipped up a perfectly light and glossy egg foam. And so after all of this scientizing, publishing a letter in Nature, proving the way that the molecules move from the copper into the egg foam and so on, that copper bowls were the right way to do things, in fact, it turns out not to be true. If you want the chemical details, I suggest you read the book. Otherwise, I would encourage you to go home and enjoy the process of making a light meringue in whatever bowl you want in blissful ignorance. Thank you.
I think that Rachel will entertain questions or comments if there are questions that some people might have for her. There.
Yeah, I have a question. With all your work on bioethics, I'm just wondering if you see this emphasis on food while so many people are starving as somewhat unethical.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let me repeat the question. So the woman who just asked the question knows that among other things I do, as Mary Jo said, is bioethics. And part of the question is, do I see the emphasis on especially this haute kind of cuisine and on all these intricacies of food as unethical against the backdrop of what we know many people don't even have, basic meals, basic nutrients, and so on. I actually think it's pretty fundamental to solving problems about famine and starvation and nutrition, understanding people's relationships with food. And so I see looking at sort of the history and the culture through which these have developed and the social mechanisms as fairly essential to developing a much better understanding of why the problems are created in the way they do. I think some people would argue, and I would agree, that some of the reasons why famine is what it is, it's such a force, is because food is incredibly politically powerful. You know, it's One of the things that, there was an argument recently on one of the listservs in the field about, why study food rather than anything else? Why use this as the window into history and culture? And many people pointed out, and I think this is true, food is sort of the one thing we all share in common, other than being human. We might not end up reproducing, we might have very different lives, we might, whatever. If you stop to think about it, there's a few other things, but, there's very, very little. And the one thing we share in common is a need for food and a construction of a lot of our lives around getting it, seeking it, and so on. And I think it's an important thing to notice because, the mechanics of what's caused famine and the structures in the world today go far beyond supply. We know supply exists, it's just in the wrong places, when you look at the statistics. So I think generally paying attention to the psychology and the social forces surrounding food is essential, in fact, for solving some of the ethical problems. Now, what about things like this sort of high-end molecular gastronomy, people paying ridiculous amounts to go to restaurants serving kind of crazy things? I think, people spend ridiculous amounts of money on all sorts of things. I don't think this is any more problematic ethically than any other things that people do that are quite luxury good things. Now, you may well think, and I would tend to agree with you in some cases, that people misuse their money and they really should be redistributing to other groups and so on. But I think that's a more generic problem that is not specific at all to haute cuisine or gastronomy. It's just more generally a consumption culture that we're oriented in. That makes people, in some sense, express themselves through consumption rather than other ways. But I don't think it's a unique issue to food or to cuisine.
Bob?
Most of your examples seem to relate to the taste of food. Now I just wonder if this science can be used or is being used to address how best to prepare food to preserve its nutritional value or to maximize its nutritional value. That would seem to me, because those are the kinds of questions that most often come up. If you microwave something, does this deprive it of nutritional value, cooking versus raw, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so the same principles are used to investigate kind of whether nutritional value is retained or not retained. Those are more traditional questions of food science that we actually have pretty good evidence about in lots of cases. One example actually segues into the question that was asked a minute ago. Homer Cantu, who has a restaurant in Chicago and does molecular gastronomy, among other things has created edible rice paper, which, the Japanese rice paper, but he injects it with flavors and so on, including nutrients and vitamins and so on. And from the molecular gastronomy point of view, this is kind of amusing because you can eat your sushi as a flat piece of paper rather than an actual, and it tastes like that. But from the point of view of, and I have really mixed feelings about this, but from the point of view more generally of nutrition and so on, there's been some discussion of attempting to use this as a way to provide nutrients in an easy form to developing countries where they're lacking. There's all sorts of instances of sociological mistakes by dropping pork in Muslim countries and dropping, things that nobody was going to eat in Africa, hoping then they'd eat it without being aware of the local traditions. But I think that's an interesting place where at least some people are playing with how you can, in fact, enrich foods through vitamin content and nutritional value and so on in easy, accessible forms. So there's potential for crossover between kind of the haute cuisine and the nutrition side. To date, there haven't been a lot of actual initiatives, but certainly there's no reason to think that the same methods couldn't be used. That's interesting. Okay, so the question, I know you can't necessarily hear, though, is there a gender component going on here? Actually, I didn't think about that. Every single picture I showed you was a male chef, but that's because every single chef basically doing molecular gastronomy that's of any repute or any renown is in fact a man. But then furthermore, even if you just leave that aside, there aren't that many people doing it. The language, as you pointed out, of old wives' tales, of the sort of diminishing kind of attitude seems to be gendered. I think there may be something going on there, but I guess I'd take it that there's a more general sort of gendering of cuisine. So I mean, traditionally, of course, professional chefs, particularly of the highest level, and the ones that would be engaging in these old wives' tales are all men, because traditionally cuisine, if not cookery, was a male domain. In the household, completely different thing. But professional cookery has been a male domain until very, very, very recently in history. So I see it more as not a gendering, but as a distinction between science, non-science, power, control kinds of dialogues, which would firmly put the traditional professional chef in the category of being wrong, or being in the category of the old wives' tales. I think it just reflects the typical gendering of power in scientific rhetoric, rather than anything particular about whether the participants happen to be male or female, because pretty much across the board, these are all going to be males fighting it out on either side.
Is there a comparable history of scientific efforts to create artistic masterpieces?
Say the last bit again, I'm sorry.
Is there a history of a comparable effort to scientifically produce masterpieces of art?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So is this just happening sort of in one domain, or is there sort of this battle in the making scientific and art? I don't know as much about that, but a couple examples come quickly to hand. There's an increasing amount of art that is produced so-called scientifically, using scientific principles. But I don't, when I've done some reading about that for various reasons, I don't see that they're saying it's better art, they're just saying it's another means of representation. They don't seem to position it in the same way as preferred or better, or that there's one right answer. Because in some sense, art is firmly in that domain of taste. You know, you might like, you know, the portrait that's done using fractals, and I might not. I might prefer, you know, Van Gogh's self-portrait or whatever. I think we much more clearly have a sense that it's absolutely correct to see this as a matter of taste, and some things will some things we want in a living room, some things we'll look at the museum, some things we won't tolerate. Cooking is a funny thing because it resides kind of on this funny boundary. On the one hand, we know it's a matter of taste in some sense, but on the other hand, we are concerned about getting it right and wrong. And I think particularly in the 20th and into the 21st century, the sense that there are correct ways of doing things has become really dominant. And it's, in my opinion, one of the reasons people are scared of cooking now, because they're scared of making mistakes. Whereas to a certain extent in art, sure, there's bad art and good art, depending on what people think. But making more scientific art is just an interesting way of representing it. There are other domains in art where science has been helpful, conservation and other things. And there are battles that shape up. So that's the other part, the other immediate response I had to your question. There are battles that shape up among conservationists about, you know, what is the correct way to do conservation on the scientific principles, then how do you retain the colors and the representation in a way that's faithful to the original? Do you do it in terms of social historical information? Do you go based on what the science tells you about the paint? And that's been a debate in many instances when they try to do full-scale restorations. But again, from what I know even less about that. I don't see the same rhetoric of the science being the ultimate arbiter. Certainly the historians and the curators and the others who are involved in conservation have as much a say in those efforts as a scientist.
Well, all right, one more question. We'll take one more, and that's the last one.
The emerging field of culinology, do you see that as a threat to the creative empirical tradition in cooking, or is it something of a marriage in that tradition to molecular gastronomy?
Yeah. So is molecular gastronomy a threat, and the scientizing? Sorry? Culinology. Well, that's another example of a similar thing. I think all of these things can be married to the traditional techniques and so on, and the traditional approaches to produce a new and creative outcome. And mostly that's what we want. We want not only new and creative, but things that are more nutritional, things that taste better, things that are interesting. We get bored as human beings, especially with the things that we eat. And so I think any of these trends can be married up. The danger is just taking one of them too far and thinking that it's the ultimate, again, arbiter of what's right, what's true, what's good. And you know, I guess I'd make a similar argument to the one that I made with molecular gastronomy, that I think there are certain bits of information and things that can be provided that would in fact enhance cuisine as a big picture thing without taking away from it, without depending just on, say, culinology or just on molecular gastronomy and so on.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks,
Thank
Miko.
you.